Okay, so good evening, everybody. After what's been a rather enlightening and invigorating debate in the afternoon, we're now sitting with an eminent panel to really discuss what's a pertinent issue, harnessing diversity to build inclusive workplaces. And it's been an academic discussion, so I think maybe for the next half an hour or so, we'd make it a little more practical and how possibly this vast academic topic can actually be practicalized into our day-to-day lives and our company. So I want to begin with you, Iman Ghosh. We were just speaking before the panel the panel discussion began, and you said something very important about inclusion. We're at this stage in India right now where by 2020, probably 20% of the workforce globally is going to come from India. So apart from the challenges of manpower, apart from the challenges of talent, inclusion and representation of diverse sections of the society is also going to be a key challenge that India would be facing.
Sure. So about a year ago, the Academy of Human Resource Development did an in-depth study on Gen Y, and we took a two-track approach. We looked at of course, quantitative research, but also qualitative research. And some of the findings were very interesting. One of the things that I've been writing about for 20 years now is on how we can look at the concept of inclusion, not just within organizations, but can we extend it to community development, even nation building. A lot of the corporate sector, a lot of what HR professionals do is limited in impact to organizations within the corporate sector. Now you have very large organizations outside the corporate sector, the government, for example, that could benefit from good HR practices, but the government and the corporate sector really comprise only about 7% of the total workforce. There is a huge segment, about 93% of our workforce, that is in the informal sector. And can good HR principles begin to make a difference in this larger informal sector? Last February, I was invited to give a talk at the National Defense College in Delhi, addressing these issues. I had a deck of slides, about 50 slides. The talk was about an hour long, followed by a 1 hour Q&A. And part of the challenge will be to try and compress it within 5 minutes. But I think we can begin, for example, what are the kind of issues? December before last, the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, released a report that stated that 42% of India's children are malnourished, and he called it a national shame. Can HR begin to address an issue of this magnitude? And it turns out that, yes, there are a few things that HR can definitely do. One of it relates to the quality of healthcare in the rural sector. This is a talent management issue. How can you attract doctors and develop healthcare workers who are willing to work in the rural sector to begin addressing issues of malnutrition? There is a direct correlation between the quality of healthcare, maternal care, and issues like this. Now, we find that, for example, in the healthcare sector, we only have sporadic recruitment campaigns, ad hoc benefits for doctors. Now, can HR make a difference?
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's really a vast realm to be covered, and we can't even begin to get there. But Bhavna, if I can come to you, has workplace diversity even come to become an HR issue, even if you just restrict it to the formal sector? Forget the informal sector for a bit.
So, in my experience across a few companies, I think there have been a set of initiatives or a set of practices that have been implemented in the name of diversity. But the thing that I'm left with always is that whatever the initiatives be, and I can quote a few examples that I think are best practices, the place where diversity really comes to force, so to speak, is when you consider, once you have brought the diversity in the door, how do you deal with it? And the emotions that are there, sometimes stated and sometimes unstated. Many a times, the emotions around managing a diversity program, when addressed well, the program runs well, and there is a lot of creativity in organizations. But when unaddressed, and it is unfortunate that emotions in general in most corporates and organizations are hardly addressed, especially emotions of the negative kind. But the fact is that if you were to introduce a diversity program, there will be emotions like insecurity, anxiety, fear, shame, guilt, and these are all legitimate feelings. They are all legitimate emotions that will exist in the organization. The quality of the program that you run around diversity will become potent only if you have the skill and the sensitivity to manage these emotions well. So I can quote a set of examples, and maybe we can come to that at a point. Sure. But I do think that the way that most organizations look at diversity today is in the tangible form. So there's anything that you can see and touch and feel. So for example, it's demographics of any kind. Okay, so there is men and women, there is abilities and disabilities, and so on and so forth. All that can be put into metrics, they can be managed, they can be run. Things like emotions, things like intellectual diversity cannot be managed, cannot be put into metrics, but they are the core of managing diversity.
If you look at what can be put into metrics, Dipali, every organization has a chief marketing officer. Does every organization have a chief diversity officer?
So I think from a matrix point of view, especially in diversity, I think one of the things that works well, and I have seen in the organizations that I've worked with, is being able to understand what is your leader's diversity quotient. And when we say diversity quotient, essentially would focus not only on gender diversity, but essentially on intellectual diversity, on diversity of teams, and diversity of roles that this leader has done, on diversity of geographies this leader has handled. So I think this is a pretty measurable thing, but it's about what is the priority for the organization from a diversity perspective. So you could have a broad global diversity objective, but locally you could be having a typical different diversity issue. So it's the weightage that you give to the different parameters, and depending on the weightage that you give, you then calculate the leader's diversity quotient.
Right. Let's really now come to some of the challenges that we'll all face, especially here in India, Indian companies would face. And Jayakant, you said you'd be interested to talk about multi-generational diversity. Now, there are reports that suggest that the average age of the Indian workforce would reduce from 37 to 29 in a matter of time. Given that your workforce is getting younger, should Indian companies really start getting more sensitive towards the needs of the older population, whether it's to do with simple facilities available in your office environment, or to do with promotions, or simply to give a thrust to the sort of skill set that an older population can bring in?
So I think when you look at generational diversity, it kind of reflects the society which we live in. I think that's something which is very real, because if you walk into any home today, you will probably see great-grandchildren, grandchildren, children, and parents, okay? And that's what you will see in the workplace as well. And the needs are very different. The attitudes of each generation is very different. So in the next 10 to 12 years, what I really foresee happening in the Indian workplace is there will be 4 generations of people, probably doing the same thing. And when they're doing the same thing at different levels, there is bound to be conflict. There is bound to be a lot of misunderstanding, and there is bound to be different needs. So what the millennial will need will be very different from what the elderly generation will need from the workplace. So I think it will be a huge challenge for HR practitioners like all of us in this panel to really look at that aspect of diversity with really serious lens. Otherwise, the demographic dividend which we've been touting to the whole world could end up being a liability. Okay, so I think that is a huge aspect of diversity which we need to look at.
Absolutely. Professor Keith, do you think applying these concepts becomes more complex in a society like ours, where you still have concepts of misogyny, for instance, or discrimination on the basis of caste present?
Yeah, I think when you look at the organized sector, especially some of the corporates and so on, I think they've been attempting and then dealing fairly well with the diversity issues. At least there is some earnest attempt to do that. There are programs, there are OD interventions and so on. There is a certain amount of awareness and consciousness. But if you look at the vast amount of other organizations which are in the less high profile, not the very well organized, and the huge areas of the non-organized sector, then you really begin to see the frightening consequences of diversity. One of the things when we think of diversity, we almost always think of gender diversity, which is in sense a very critical issue. But I think there are larger issues in a country like that. There is a socio-economic diversity. There is the diversity between the rich and the poor, which exists in society but is reflected in the dynamics within organizations. We see an increasing as the society becomes wealthy, organizations become wealthy. Again, the gap between the rich and poor within the organized sector as well as outside the organized sector is increasing. That's creating more expectations, that's creating tensions, and that is, I think, that's really something that we are probably sitting on a kind of a time bomb, I think, in a country like ours where there are such severe disparities and growth is not carrying everybody along. So this is one issue that would have to be addressed at the societal level, but I think we also need to address it at the level where we can manage it, and that is in the organized sector, in the corporates and so on, where something can be done about these things.
Right. John, how do you look at India in comparison to the rest of the world, especially the developed world? And you can be politically incorrect about this. In terms of applying and embracing concepts like diversity, like multiculturalism, you see all of these really thriving, especially in countries like the UK, for instance. You look at a BBC program, and even in a kids' show, they have color representation from every part of the world.
India's unique. I mean, the variety here, that's one of the fascinating things I find living here. The many languages, the cultural differences, just 80 k's away, and there's a new culture. So it's extraordinary that the way you hold together. And as I think about it, one of my great friends in Bangalore, he's a priest, and he was just starting a new parish. And he was confronted with a lot of tension initially between Kannada speakers, Malayalam speakers, Tamil speakers, etc. And I said, how are you going to handle this? And he didn't know at that moment. But now, 2 years later, there's harmony in the whole group because he divided it up and he made each zone, 6 zones in the geographic zones. And it was like a business project that everybody was involved in. It wasn't a business project, but it was actually getting people to organise themselves as a community so that all these differences had to blend together to create an identity that was bigger than just those. So I believe in a company, one of the simple solutions is to gather people around a very viable project, get them all involved, and I believe that that will help dissolve so many tensions and discriminations as people get to know one another. And I know that as I've taught advanced coaching skills to senior people, they do work well together. They seem to interact because they feel that responsibility to achieve things as a team, to get things going. Does that help at all to give that little idea of...
Absolutely, but if I could take this forward with Iman, India is also unique in the sense that we have examples where diversity, for instance, or the need to represent has not really gone too well in terms of policy. So for instance, you have reservation at the government level that in some sense is trying to promote diversity. So give us a sense of areas where forced diversity can actually go wrong, where possibly there's a need for a certain kind of people, but simply in order to sort of have a more varied representation, you end up with people from all sorts of backgrounds?
Well, India is a democracy, and our constitution mandates that every section of our society has a voice. That's a very HR concept. So bringing about this representation may be unpopular with groups that have had privileges in the past. Now, but then as a nation moves forward, we need to carry all our citizens forward. Now, I think we have perhaps gone about this the sort of wrong way. Rather than, for example, increasing the number of educational institutions, looking at the quality of education, I think there are paradigm shifts that need to be made, even when we look at the important issue of education. As somebody mentioned earlier this afternoon, India is not going to have our demographic dividend unless we are able to upskill our population. I mean, India is going to remain a young nation until about 2065, if you look at demographic studies. China is likely to peak around 2025 because of the one-child policy. I personally believe that we might have a reverse colonization because we are one of the few countries in the world that will have the manpower. I mean, every other country is aging rapidly. In fact, not too many people have made a link between deficits and demographics. But as you have an aging population and fewer people or a fewer percentage of the population in the workforce, governments get less revenue. They have a larger population to support. So we might assume that Greece, for example, are profligate spenders. But if we drill a little deeper, we might find that there are demographic issues at play. For example, Japan in the 1980s just flatlined in terms of their growth. I think we're seeing that in the rest of the world today. And the gross enrollment ratio in higher education in India is about 13.8% at the moment. Globally, the average is about 30%. In advanced nations, you have 60%. So the vision of our Ministry of Human Resource Development is to increase the gross enrollment ratio to about 30%, double of where we are today. But then we're not just looking at the quantity of education, we also need to look at quality. Right. And I'll just flag one quick issue. I believe we need a paradigm shift from teacher-centric pedagogy to learner-centric andragogy, where, just very quickly to touch on just one issue there.
Right. Dibali, do you often see companies facing this dilemma between diversity and meritocracy? Just want to take that argument forward. I mean, on one hand, you want women to crack the glass ceiling, but on the other hand, do companies risk the idea that maybe you're giving a particular class of people too much representation simply because you want to show the world that you're diverse?
Yeah, so it depends on the organization. I mean, some of the organizations that I've seen do lip service to this, and therefore they want to have more women representation versus the delivery and the quality of delivery, right? But there are organizations that genuinely want to change that diversity ratio by upskilling the workforce that is not as represented in the diversity, distribution. Yeah, so I think this will always be a challenge for organizations, but it's like saying that I'm going to a new market, I don't have that skill, right? And I have to flush in a certain set of people who have the skills versus I need to develop that skill locally. Yeah. Now, if you don't develop that skill locally, you can never get the diverse workforce because you're always going to be getting and what should I say, getting people from one market into the other. Whereas if you want to create the diversity in that market, you have to then upskill those people. So I think it's a very fine line between diversity and meritocracy, and that's where the organizations need to be careful in terms of how they're evaluating. What are the evaluation systems for meritocracy? Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant point. So I have questions around what is merit and what is meritocracy. So right here, so for example, this debate of, whether or not a woman should be put in a particular job because she's meritorious versus because she's just a woman, we have to be clear. Why are we putting a woman in that job? We're putting a woman in that job because you perhaps want a different way of doing that job, a different way of the type of results that you want to get, right? And if you are doing that, then the means by which you measure what is merit and what is meritocracy needs to be questioned.
Right.
So I think this debate of whether or not, it is, a gender-based selection is contingent on how you have defined what your performance metrics are.
Right. I think one means by which most companies measure merit is bottom line, for sure. But,
Great point.
Jayakanthan, is there any correlation between diversity and bottom line and how a diverse group of workforce can actually help a company enhance their profits?
100%. I think there is a direct correlation having a diverse team of people working on a particular project and the success of that particular project. And then when you go to the market with that particular product, how successful or unsuccessful it is. So McKinsey's done some studies which show that companies which have women representation have consistently outbeaten the market. And this is based on statistics and data. And even if you were to look at our own societies where we inhabit, as more and more people of, let's keep even if we keep the dialogue around the gender diversity issue, the women population is 50% of our country, and the women population, when empowered, becomes consumers, isn't it? And when they become consumers, there is obviously a direct correlation to the bottom line. So I think if organizations truly want to be successful, having diverse thinking, and diverse thinking comes from diverse groups of people in the room, and that then comes the products which are really, really successful. For example, I can talk of an example, a company like Google, which has been phenomenally successful in the last 14 years, $40 billion in 14 years. It's never probably happened in our lifetimes, isn't it? It may never happen again. And if you were to see some of the things which really drove there was the strong emphasis on diversity from day one as a company. And I think that is a direct correlation from diversity to the bottom line.
John, this might sound ironical, but does diversity always play a nurturing role? At a time when most companies are looking at homogeneity, when we're always looking for end products that look like each other, when there's a monoculture of sorts. So can diversity sometimes be a nuisance?
It's so obvious to me that we live in this dynamic world, and any organization that's going to survive has got to keep changing, keep right up there at, I call the edge of creative chaos, where you're exploring new possibilities. Now, that means you need diversity, you need creative thinking, you need to cultivate it, get it on side, bring it about. So, that's my simple response to a question like that.
But Dr. Keith, there may be some sectors, for instance, more than others, where diversity is more welcome. I mean, in the army, for instance, you wouldn't want either diversity of thoughts or diversity of able bodies, for instance.
Yeah, I would suggest that, interestingly, I was just reading some articles in preparation for this in terms of what does research say about diversity and its impact on this. And it's interesting that diversity by itself does not necessarily lead to improvement in productivity or so, unless that diversity has to be managed.
Right.
Homogeneity is always more manageable. It may not lead to high productivity and high creativity, but it's more manageable. But except that I think it creates a culture of, in typical homogeneous culture, you have a culture of submissiveness, you have a culture of a kind of a group thing. Heterogeneous, diverse kind of culture encourages creativity. It encourages different perspectives. It's something that, enriches. But when it depends on what kind of diversity. If you have very serious diversity in terms of socioeconomic differences and so on, then those can be actually a powder keg. Actually, it can be something that can be potentially dangerous unless it is managed. Organizations that have successfully managed diversity are those which have consciously developed it, created a culture. It's not something that can happen overnight. Okay? And the attempt to encourage diversity without trying to control for various factors can sometimes lead to disaster, which is, I think, what is happening. We are thrown into a situation where a lot of diversity is coming into our society in India. And I think right now we are going through a very turbulent phase trying to deal with that diversity. Those organizations where diversity has succeeded is where people have carefully nurtured and managed that diversity and channelized it in proper ways.
Right.
So we need to think of that at the national level also, perhaps.
Sure. Before we actually open this debate to the audience, just want to start wrapping up comments. So with you, Imran, first, in terms of what Indian companies really need to do going ahead, do we need to adapt to more dynamic approach towards concepts like these?
Sure. So, as Keith mentioned, the rate of change in the environment is accelerating. Companies, we know, will only survive when their capacity to change exceeds the changes that are forced on them or the change in the environment. There's a joke that Lehman Brothers would not have gone bankrupt if they were Lehman sisters instead. So yes, I think diversity is key to competitiveness and managed diversity. And as Indian companies become more global, I think we're going to have more diversity rather than less. But I also believe that India has an advantage. Even within India, we have such diverse cultures working so well with each other that I think it is a core competence of Indian organizations to begin with.
Bhavna, do we see this becoming the buzzword then for HR practitioners?
I think it already is a buzzword, and that is perhaps a part of the problem. But that said, I think I personally, passionately believe that we can get the best of each other when we recognize the fact that you and I are similar and yet different, and we can hold this simultaneously. Not just one-on-one, but as groups, as teams, as organizations. So we are similar and yet different. And there is beauty in it. Of course, it needs to be managed. And by managed, I mean there will be a whole lot of emotions around it. There will be anxieties around it. It will be all new. It will be some stuff that we haven't seen before. But I think having the sensitivity to handle anything new that pops up and say, okay, now we are faced with this. What are we going to do about it? Rather than say, in our organization, this is how things ought to be, or you need to fall in this, we will never realize the individual potential. The individual potential is realized best when the person realizes the self. The realization of that self happens when the person can be authentic to that person. And that each person is unique. So allowing people to be unique means managing a lot, means overheads, means being surprised, means not being cookie cutter. And it's going to be a challenge. And
John,
an
it's definitely going to be a challenge at a time when you have an economy that's facing a slowdown, not just here in India, but it's a global slowdown. So concepts like these probably take a backseat at times like these.
Well, it's true. One of the things that suffers so much in an economic downturn is investment in training. And yet that's a time when you need to be training people. That's the best time to invest, I believe, in training, getting them ready for the rise. Because you can give up people, get rid of them, slim down, but then when the rise comes up, you haven't got the quality people. So invest in your people when it's down, somehow find that investment, and then you'll be ready to head the crowd as the wave comes up into economic stability again.
Dipali?
I think what he's saying makes a lot of sense. And I think when you're talking about, a bad time, that's the time when you can actually leverage the real face time and the quality time of managers. Because all the time when your business is running and when you're in a great economy, which is booming, most of the times leaders and managers don't have time to nurture talent. right? And I think that's the biggest opportunity in in an environment where the business is not doing very well. I think that's what we need to kind of, it may not be related to cost. You can still do good trainings without incurring very high costs. But to get the manager's time is always a big challenge in organizations. So I think this can really be managed. And I would agree with John on what he's saying.
All right, last word to you, Jayakanthan. Is the next 20 years going to be better than the last 20 years for people who are probably away from the mainstream to actually find a voice?
I think so, because at least, if I restrict my comments towards the formal sector, there is a growing awareness and acceptance that it is important to become more inclusive. And I think a lot of this change is being driven bottom up as well, rather than a top-down agenda. I know the leader wants to kind of drive diversity and inclusion, maybe as a buzzword, as some of my co-panelists were saying. But I'm sure a lot of people, from the bottom up are kind of clamoring for it, saying that, why don't we have people from socio-economic backgrounds, in different socio-economic backgrounds in organization? What are we trying to do? If you see today in the corporations we all inhabit, the youngsters are actually getting a more genuine corporate social responsibility feeling than just lip service, which was the case in the past. Okay? So I actually see that thanks to the changing workforce in our country, at least in the formal sector, there is going to be a push, a bottom-up push to the top, saying that we need to start looking at people who are not the normal definition of a professional in the companies. So definitely it's going to be much better than what it was in the past. But I think 20 years later, it's going to be a bigger challenge for us to continue sustaining it.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll throw it open to the audience. Would request you to please say who you're addressing your question to.
Okay, so my one question is, harnessing diversity is good, but forcing diversity is not good. Government of India has tried to promote diversity by making reservations for SC, ST, and OBCs. Now they are trying to bring out a regulation which will have also a reservation for promotions. Like SC, ST, OBC, they will get promotions also. In public sector, it is okay, but if they extend this to private sector, so it will be a disaster. So is it the right way to promote diversity?
Well, I personally disagree with what the government of India is doing on creating these reservation policies. I think the real place where this problem needs to be addressed is providing high quality education to people who can't afford it. Yeah, and I think that's where it needs to be fixed. By creating reservation quotas is not really the solution, because it comes back to the same thing where you're saying that I hire people who are not competent to drive the economy of a nation. I think that can be really, really dangerous. So I don't think so that's a great way to do it. I think we need to have very strong social programs that will enable the education of the not so privileged people in the country.
But what about the argument then that you need to give a level playing field to people who've been historically subjugated? So, yeah.
Okay. I know it's a very emotive issue to talk about this reservation thing. I partially agree with you, Dipali, but I also feel that, when you're dealing with diversity on such a, so much of diverse difference on such a massive scale as we have in our country, you need both pull and push factors. The fact is that even developed societies have had a lot of emphasis on affirmative action. The kind of initiatives that you see in the US, the disadvantaged communities there, they have benefited a lot from the affirmative action, and there has been, of course, a lot of, similar to what we have in our country by way of reservations, which have been resented. But simultaneously, there are opportunities for improving the socioeconomic living standards, access to education, provision of health facilities. These are simultaneous things that need to be taken. Merely imposing reservation without taking care of those things is only going to create all kinds of nasty pressures in organizations.
Absolutely.
So I think it requires both these factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I think what he's talking about is a quota on promotions which has just been introduced. But if anybody else has a question.
Why can't you do it economically backward than born socially, whatever, several caste backward? Could not a Brahmin student go ahead? I'm sorry.